Hey everybody, welcome to the Ask the Expert for the winning Azure Active Directory strategies for identity, security, and governance. I hope you enjoyed the session earlier today, and I'm pleased to bring our experts today to help answer some questions that you might have. First, a couple ground rules. How to engage with the experts. Use the chat, please, to ask the questions. Go ahead and start entering them now whenever you're ready. Questions will appear to all attendees once approved by the moderators, and then you can upvote your favorite questions using the like sign, and then our experts will answer the questions either over the chat or I can bring them up as many as I can during the conversation. Experts will provide resources once the session concludes, so I'll have some to show you at the very end. In terms of etiquette, this session may be recorded. Please help our moderators and don't spam or post inappropriate comments. And then you'll see here the Microsoft Code of Conduct, which is also in the Q&A if you would like to review it in detail. But again, we don't tolerate harassment or discrimination in any way, so please be respectful throughout. Now let's get to the experts. We have two fantastic experts today. We have Nitika Gupta, Principal PM Manager Identity, and Rahul Prakash, Principal PM Manager Identity as well, talking about all the things you just heard about in winning the strategies. And so to start off, I have a couple questions that came in earlier today. So we'll start with Nitika. And you mentioned a little bit about legacy auth before. What are some tips for customers in disabling legacy auth?
Thank you, Melanie. Just a bit more about me. I am a Principal PM Manager in Identity team at Microsoft. My team focuses on the security aspects. Specifically, we focus on Azure AD Conditional Access and Azure Multi-Factor Authentication story. And I'm really looking forward to this session. Going back to the question, Melanie, about blocking legacy authentication, as most folks might have heard, blocking legacy authentication can reduce your attack surface by about 67%. To roll out a block legacy authentication policy, the first step I would suggest is to leverage the sign-in from legacy authentication workbook. You can find this workbook under the workbook section in the Azure AD portal. This workbook provides you an overview of the users, the applications that are using legacy auth. From there, you can start blocking off the users that do not use legacy auth. So this is your user base that it will have no impact. And once you have those users blocked, from there, you incrementally start rolling out the block legacy authentication policy for the rest of your users. Another tip there is to enable that block legacy authentication policy in report-only mode. This will allow you to understand the impact of the policy on your users, be able to communicate directly to those users in advance, and then provide guidance to your help desk and equip them in case end users do have questions. So to summarize, use the sign-ins from legacy authentication workbook, use report-only mode as you're rolling out policies, do an incremental rollout starting off with users that have least impact by blocking legacy authentication. I'll hand off to Melanie.
Thank you. Great tips there on disabling legacy auth. Now, Rahul, one for you. For an organization that's just starting out on their identity governance journey, what would you recommend that they do first?
Cool. Thanks, Melanie. So, hey, everyone. My name is Rahul Prakash, also a Principal Program Manager at Microsoft. And my team focuses on identity governance. So Melanie, to your question on what should customers go do first, we covered this a little bit in our presentation earlier today, but one of the first things that you need to do and should do is connect your applications to Azure AD and then bring your users into Azure AD. We've announced cloud provisioning at the last Ignite, and we've also talked about how you can connect to your Workday and SuccessFactors to bring your users straight from HR tools into Azure AD. And what this lets you do is then take advantage of all the richness that we provide in all of our features. So once you have your apps and users in Azure AD, the next thing to do is to go take an inventory of resources in your directory to see which resources are the most sensitive ones, and start turning on some of the governance features that we have Some of the ones that are very easy to turn on, very quick to turn on, is something like access reviews for your compliance sensitive or security sensitive resources like groups or applications. And then also use privileged identity management to make sure that you're reducing the footprint of administrators who have permanent standing access, because you don't want stuff like that happening. And then as you graduate down into more advanced governance functionality, you should think about using Azure AD entitlement management to govern the access of your employees as well as guest users to sensitive resources in your organization. Oh, and sorry, one last thing I would mention is my colleagues Mark Wall and Elizabeth Olson also had a presentation on some of these aspects at Ignite. So they have an on-demand session that I'd highly recommend you check out.
Great, yeah, and we'll have a link to those resources at the end as well. Another question for Nitika. We heard a lot about conditional access in the session. How can conditional access enable remote work?
This is such a relevant question to all of us who are dialing into this session from their homes. So like looking back, right, we were living in a world where organizations could rely on policies that were based on network, because the expectation was that users working from the company network, from their devices, they are physically in the buildings. That is no longer true, especially today where we all are all working remotely. And you need like a policy framework that is more comprehensive, that can go beyond the network to looking at every element of the access, whether it be the user, the risk associated with the sign-in, the application that the user is trying to access, the sensitivity of that data that is within that application, whether it's a managed device or an unmanaged device, or the kind of OS on the device. And based on all these conditions, you want to be able to enforce a set of controls where you want to require multi-factor authentication for stronger auth, or you want to make sure that user is coming from a healthy device. It could be a compliant device or a hybrid Azure AD joint device, or you could require limited access if you don't fully trust the conditions of the sign-in. So we live in a time where network-based policies are no longer sufficient, and you need a more comprehensive policy framework similar to conditional access to enable remote work and look at the sign-in more holistically and enforce all the restrictions to enable secure productivity.
Great, thank you. We did get a question that came in, and please continue to add more here. So the question came in and it says, we have lots of service principals listed in the enterprise applications. How can I tell what is critical for Azure M365 services? Rahul, do you want to take a shot at that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. There is a whole army of folks on my team and other teams who are working on service principals and more governance of service principals. But I think the very first thing you should do is, well, I mean, you could visually look at the list, but the list is, I'm assuming it's extremely long, which is why you're posting the question here in the first place. So there's obviously the ones that you do recognize, right? There might be some third-party SaaS applications like Salesforce and Box and ServiceNow. And those ones I think you can put to the side. The other ones are ones that people in your organization may have created, application developers may have created, and you're not sure what they're meant for anymore. There's a couple of things you can go start doing now. One thing to look at is which groups are assigned to those applications. You can use PowerShell and scripts. We have lots of this documented, but you can basically look at ways to see how many users are assigned to those service principals because of group membership. And you might find service principals that have 20,000 users assigned to them. And those are the ones that you might consider more something to go look at and clean up in case you think that that's not correct. Another aspect to look at is the service principal doing something? What kind of sign-ins does the service principal have by itself? And we just announced a feature in public preview, I believe it was in the last month or two, where when you look at sign-ins, you can not only look at user sign-ins, but you can look at sign-ins by service principals. So that's something that you should look at as well. And service principals that have not signed in and users who are not assigned to service principals, if you find service principals that have no usage, are not signing in, aren't doing anything on behalf of users, are not assigned to privileged roles, those are probably service principals you want to consider either cleaning up or disabling until you figure out their real use going forward.
To build on what Rahul is saying, he talked about discovery, he talked about governance. From a security lens, think of applying stronger authentication to service principals as well. So think about requiring cert-based authentication over password-based authentication for your service principals. So once you're beyond the first step of discovery, think about how can you harden security of the service principal. And as Rahul mentioned, our teams continue to invest in providing customers a holistic story for security and governance for service principals and holistically non-human identities. Back to Melanie.
Thank you. We got some great questions coming in. This one, Nitika, for local Windows 10 logon to desktop and Windows Server admin login, are you able to use Azure MFA and passwordless for the login experience for your desktop?
Good question. It's been a common question at Ignite conference this year. So what are some strong authentication methods that are supported from for Windows Logon? The good news there is that we actually support 2 of our passwordless authentication methods with Windows Logon. So you can require Windows Hello for Business, which can require a PIN on the device, or it can work with a biometrics gesture that's supported on that hardware as well. The second MFA or stronger authentication method option is to use FIDO2 security keys, where you can simply insert that FIDO key to your machine and you'll be signed in to your Windows machine. So we do have 2 options. Luckily, those are passwordless options to use.
Thank you. More questions coming in here. Give me a second here. So will there be more granular RBAC roles in AAD that can be scoped like an EXO, e.g. user can only modify users in a specific domain? Rahul, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, I can take a stab at that one. So at a holistic level, we're looking at more granular roles and more custom roles where we allow you to have very granular roles and attributes for access control. That said, this is on the roadmap. It's coming. But I don't have much more than that at the moment. I do know that there was another session that we had on RBAC roles by Abhijit and Steve during Ignite, and that might have more content that would be interesting to you.
Great. Okay. Another one came in, Nitika. How can we back up and restore and version conditional access policies?
Thank you, Melanie. This is becoming a popular topic increasingly because customers are relying heavily on conditional access as their way of enforcing policies throughout the organization. Good news is that we recently released the general availability of our conditional access APIs. So you can use Microsoft Graph API or PowerShell to manage conditional access policies. On top of that, we also released a set of scripts that you can find published on GitHub, which will allow customers to automate the lifecycle of their conditional access policy management. And on top of that, you can build conditional access policy management into your existing business processes that you couldn't do before. Going back to the specific question, backup and restore and versioning are some of the common asks that we get from customers. And we do have scripts that are out there that can allow you to easily start versioning your policies and backup, restore your policies in your environment. We'll post the link to the GitHub on the chat, and that way folks can easily get to those scripts and try it out in your environment. Thank you.
There's in the risky user unfamiliar sign-in properties, comment that it's too sensitive, especially for VPN users and cloud proxy services like Zscaler. Is there a way to control the risk sensitivity?
Good question. 2 pieces of tips there. The first one is take a look at name location and make sure you are whitelisting all the your network to make sure that the sign-in risk policy doesn't flag those sign-ins as risky. So provide us input using name location so we understand what are networks that you trust and you do not trust. Second is, I think, one way to think about all these policies is that we learn based on user feedback. So as you start enforcing sign-in risk policies, we get a feed of feedback on what is actually risky for you or not, based on whether the user was able to complete MFA from that network or not. And then we can fine-tune your sign-in risk evaluation. So give us the opportunity where you enforce these policies and we can learn from the user behavior and the sign-in pattern more and can tune the sign-in risk for your environment. So to summarize, 2 tips: use name location to give us information about what networks are trusted. Second, roll out policies so we can learn from the usage and tune our sign-in risk.
Great. And is there a way to enforce certificate-based auth for service principals?
Good question. I know certificate-based authentication is a supported authentication mechanism for service principals. I don't know offhand if there's a way to enforce it and say that only use certificate-based authentication for service principal in my environment. We'll have to take a look and talk to the PM working on that and get back to you.
Great, thank you. And then do we have recommendations on reducing global admins?
I'll give this one to Rahul. I think it's close to him.
I can take that one. Yeah, so like one of the features that we work on in identity governance is called PIM, Privileged Identity Management, and highly recommend if you have availability of the feature, to go and look at the alerts section in the feature. What we do is we show you just some simple statistics on the number of highly privileged users in your directory. So we show you the number of highly privileged, and then we show you number of global admins. And more often than not, you'll realize that there's lots of global admins, many more than you ever thought was actually happening. As a side note, I've talked to some customers who said they had 5 or 10 global admins in their tenant, and then they go look at this dashboard, and it comes out to be that they had 30 global admins, and many global admins hadn't used their roles in a long period of time. But one of the additional alerts that we provide there is also whether those users have activated their privileged role in the last N number of days. So we will tell you for the number of global admins that you do have, how many have not activated their role. And that's a really insightful insight for customers to go determine whether those users still really need that standing global admin privilege. The main takeaway over here is just try to reduce the number of standing global admins you have in your directory to just those break glass accounts. Ensure you have MFA turned on your global admins. Make sure they use PIM, Privileged Identity Management, so that when they need to use their global admin privilege, they're required to provide a business justification. The privilege is only granted to them for a certain amount of time. And then it's also really important to make sure that the global admin role is periodically reviewed. Within Privileged Identity Management, we have a sub-feature called Access Reviews that lets you periodically review all your global admins or Exchange admins, or any admin you have in either Azure AD or your Azure subscription roles as well. And that's just a really good practice to make sure that your global admins are really the ones you want to keep as your global admins, and not some consultant from a third-party vendor or someone who just needed it for one time and still has access. So yeah, those are some tips to make sure you reduce your global admin scope.
Thanks, great tips. Another one came in. I'm wanting to enable MFA for all my users in the org in order to protect their AD credential. Did I understand that you cannot leverage Azure MFA and passwordless auth to 2-factor their Windows login? Managing FIDO2 hardware requires additional management and expense, and Hello is device-by-device enrollment. Are there plans to enable Azure AD MFA for this purpose, since we are already paying for this?
Thanks, Melanie. I can take that one. So good question. So as I mentioned earlier, we currently have FIDO 2 and Windows Hello for Business. This is definitely good feedback about how do we enable more options for our customers so they can pick the right, most secure, usable, and cost-effective option in their environment. We are looking into options like supporting phone sign-in for Windows Logon. So that is another passwordless option that you will be able to use that doesn't require either a hardware upgrade or purchasing additional keys. Users can simply use their phone as a passwordless authentication factor to sign into Windows Logon. So we are definitely looking into how do we enable more options for our customers in the future, and keep an eye on our roadmap.
Sounds great. Rahul, using PIM, is it possible to request more roles at the same time instead of making multiple requests?
That's a good question. Yeah, so yes, and I'll tell you how you can do that. So if you just in native PIM doesn't support that today. Native PIM is, and what I mean by that is if you turn on PIM, you can do one role at a time. But what we just announced is during Ignite, we announced that you can now assign groups to privileged roles. And what this allows you to do is have one group, say you have users who need to be help desk administrators and Exchange administrators and some other type of administrator. You can assign a group to these privileged roles, and then you can have users assigned to these groups. And as they get access to this group, they get all the roles associated with that group. So this allows them to have, you can actually use this feature to make sure that users, when they can elevate once into the group using privileged access groups. And once they elevate into the group, they get access to all the roles that the group has. So the answer is yes, it takes some work to stitch it together, but you can absolutely do it. Great. And by the way, this is also my team just documented this 2 or 3 weeks ago. So I'll try to dig that up and we can post it later, Melanie, if that's possible.
Thank you. And then what is the best strategy to manage identities in Azure and link them to Azure Active Directory? Do you want to take that one?
Okay, you want to try that one?
The question was, what's the best strategy to manage identities in Azure and link them to Azure AD?
That's a very interesting question because as I think of Azure Active Directory, I think of you're creating identities that can be used across the Microsoft and non-Microsoft ecosystem. Anything that can support Azure AD-based authentication. So it works with Azure, it works with Office 365, Dynamics, and it works for your SaaS apps that are set up to use Azure Active Directory Logon. I would love to get more clarification on the question. So hopefully someone from our team can circle back on the chat to go back and forth and try to get to the heart of the question and answer it.
Okay, great. Yeah, please, you can respond in the chat and we can circle back to that one. Another one, the GitHub script links in Secure Score is not enough because rich clients do not trigger a real sign-in in AAD. Any workaround known to grab this token or renewal? Rahul, do you want to take that?
Sorry, I was on mute. I can take that one, Melanie. Yeah, it sounds like the question is, I want to identify the inactive users. And so there's a couple of things that we've made available in the recent past to help you identify inactive users, right? One of them is that we now have available via graph, you can see the last sign-in of any user. Now this is the last interactive sign-in, but you can see that. Now in terms of refresh token activity, so tokens that auto refresh, that is on the roadmap as well. So soon you'll be able to see interactive as well as non-interactive sign-in activity directly via graph. And I think that'll give you exactly what you're looking for over here. One additional aspect of this is though we're bringing these kinds of insights into our governance platform so that you can actively choose to manage your inactive users in a certain way. So you might schedule a policy that says, all my inactive users must be reviewed every 90 days. If the user has been inactive for 90 days, his or her manager has to be sent an email asking them to review their access. And if this user is a guest user, especially from another vendor, another partner, and if they are denied access, that not only do we remove them from all the resources that they have access to, but then we block them from signing in and remove them from the directory, assuming they're a guest user. So there's some that is available today, some of this available today via Graph, and much more that's coming.
Great, and kind of a segue to that, Rahul, do the tools shown today in your session, do they cover B2B guests as well as the native member accounts?
Yeah, most of the tools I showed you, actually I'm thinking about all of them, do include B2B. So when we talk about access reviews, one of the top use cases for many of our customers is doing access reviews on guest membership to sensitive resources. The next one we talk about, entitlement management, is actually a really fantastic way to start governing your guest membership, because entitlement management lets you specify connected organizations. You can specify, for example, if I work at a coffee company and I have vendors from other companies, I can specify which vendors I want to work with, and that users from those vendors can use certain resources in my organization. And that is possible through entitlement management. And that comes with all these workflows and review processes, so that when users get access to resources and become part of my tenant, they're automatically reviewed every 30, 60, 90 days. Their access is revoked when they no longer need it. They're removed from the directory when they're no longer needed. So all of that is provided with entitlement management. And another feature that we didn't touch on much during the presentation, or actually we didn't touch on at all, is terms of use. And what happens quite often is when you invite B2B guest users into your tenant for collaboration, many times they don't sign any paperwork before joining. And that's kind of a gap in our compliance and overall like legal and security posture. So with terms of use, Azure AD terms of use, you can specify specific terms that you want guest users to view and accept before they get access to your tenant, before they get access to specific applications or specific resources in your tenant. So all of them cover B2B guest users.
Great. And then kind of a follow-up question from an earlier statement, Rahul, you talked about some tips for people getting started on their identity governance journey. Will they be hit by limitations while trying to extend controls to legacy or line of business applications?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, so we've actually there's a really good session by my colleague Jasmine Bethauser, and she's a PM for application proxy. App proxy is a really great way to connect back to your legacy on-prem AD apps. And as long as you're using app proxy, you get all the controls that conditional access provides, that governance provides. So yeah, and we also just announced at Ignite the header-based authentication. So if it's an app that can only be authenticated against through header-based auth, we now support that as well. Nithika, I'm curious to hear if there's anything else you want to add from the conditional access side.
I think you covered it. So I think once you publish your app through application proxy, you get the whole benefit of Azure AD, which includes conditional access. It includes identity protection and our risk-based detection. It includes multi-factor authentication now for your legacy apps, and it includes governance as well. So it's just the basic foundation to getting started with security and governance.
Great, and we just have one more question, time for one more question. This one's about conditional access. Any updates on adding manual app grouping capabilities so we can more easily manage conditional access policy across custom groups of apps?
Thank you, Melanie. I love this question. We are actually working on providing customers ability to group their set of applications and be able to apply conditional access policies to the group of apps. We've heard this feedback from really large enterprises that have thousands of apps, and having to apply CA policies to individual apps just doesn't scale and runs into scale limitations. So we are working on it. keep an eye on Alex Simon's blog or other channels where you get all your information about new features in Azure AD.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Thank you, both of you, for all of your expertise today. I do want to leave you with some resources. You can go to some of these Ignite resources, the Tech Community Video Hub, the Virtual Hub. That's where some of these on-demand videos are. Identity announcements, that was just mentioned about keeping up to date on our latest blog information. There's the link there. And then if you just want to look at all the identity sessions, you can go to the link there. And remember, you can add things to your backpack so you can view the materials from all the sessions that you attended later. So thank you again for your time, for all your questions. And if we didn't get to your question, we'll try to do some Q&A on our blog in the coming weeks. Thank you all.